It started with a hug, a kiss and a how are you from Senator Biden. 2 weeks later, in Washington, Israel, backed by the US lobby, says you can't stop us building more settlements. East Jerusalem, says Bibi, is not a settlement, it's our capital. But America, he says, is Israel's best friend. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Stephen Cole. Israel says it'll continue to build in occupied East Jerusalem despite the global community through the quartet saying a loud no. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was speaking at the conference of the pro-Israeli lobby group AIPAC. Israel has been criticised by Britain, Hillary Clinton, the European Union and Russia for ignoring demands for an end to settlement building. Well, earlier this month, the US Vice President Joe Biden was in Israel attempting to restart the indirect Israeli-Palestinian peace effort. But just after he'd arrived and said how happy he was to be in Israel, the right-wing Interior Ministry released plans for 1,600 new settler homes in East Jerusalem. That briefly soured relations. Under international law, East Jerusalem is deemed illegally occupied by Israel. The announcement was called insulting to the US and an obstacle to attempts at peace. But at the AIPAC summit, Netanyahu blamed the Palestinians for the stalled peace talks and suggested Iran was the real destabilizing factor in the region.
The connection between the Jewish people and Jerusalem cannot be denied. The Jewish people were building Jerusalem 3,000 years ago, and the Jewish people are building Jerusalem today. Jerusalem is not a settlement, it's our capital. Today, an unprecedented threat to humanity looms large. A radical Iranian regime, armed with nuclear weapons, could bring an end to the era of nuclear peace that the world has enjoyed for the last 65 years.
Well, earlier, the US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton warned that the status quo is not sustainable and expressed concern about the continuing settlement building in both Jerusalem and the West Bank, describing it as counterproductive to peace talks.
New construction in East Jerusalem or the West Bank undermines that mutual trust and endangers the proximity talks that are the first step toward the full negotiations that both sides say they want and need. And it exposes daylight between Israel and the United States that others in the region hope to exploit. It undermines America's unique ability to play a role, an essential role, in the peace process. There is another path, a path that leads towards security and prosperity for Israel, the Palestinians, and all the people of the region. But it will require all parties, including Israel, to make difficult but necessary choices.
Well, joining us now are our guests. In Washington, D.C., Meagan Buren. She's the Director of Research and Training at the Israel Project. In Chicago, John Mearsheimer. He's a Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and author of The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. And in South Bend, Indiana, Ali Abunimah. He's co-founder of the website electronicintifada.net. Do you think the Israeli lobby is too powerful and politicians play second fiddle to lobbyists?
Well, yes, it's powerful, I think, to an extent that is actually harming Israel. If you look at what happened in the past year, this is now the second cave-in by the Obama administration on the issue of settlements in the face of the intransigence of the Israel lobby. But look at the long-term problem for Israel, as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton pointed out yesterday, that because of the demographics and Palestinians becoming a majority once again throughout historic Palestine, really the only viable solution from an Israeli or Zionist perspective is a so-called two-state solution. But because of the intransigence of the lobby, there will be no two-state solution, and that really means the end of a Jewish state of Israel. But that seems to be what the Israel lobby has chosen. It's powerful to the point of self-destruction.
Meagan, the Israeli lobby in America is so powerful to the extent of self-destruction. Ali is suggesting not just damaging to Israel, but could it be also damaging to US, American interests?
I have to disagree very strongly. I think, having been at the AIPAC conference over the past number of days, you heard a few things being repeated over and over again by people that were there participating and by American politicians that were there to speak to the audience. Secretary of State Clinton said more clearly than anyone else, perhaps, that this relationship between Israel and America is in America's best interest. It's strategic importance to America for that relationship to remain strong, and that our goals are one in the same. And I think the goal that we heard spoken of.
She also suggested, Meagan, taking a different path, didn't she?
I think what she suggested is continuing on the path towards a two-state solution, which Prime Minister Netanyahu has accepted and is moving towards. One of the things that we seem to be forgetting in this conversation. I'm sorry, there's additional sound.
Absolutely fine. Meagan, carry on. I'll carry on with your answer.
Thank you. One of the things that we seem to be forgetting in this conversation is that Prime Minister Netanyahu took it upon himself and his government to put a 10-month moratorium on settlement building in the West Bank. And that was done in order to build trust measures, in order to move towards negotiations with the Palestinians towards a two-state solution where both sides can live in peace. And that seems to be something that we're forgetting. The Prime Minister has said over and over again that he hopes to come to the table and work with a Palestinian partner towards a better, more prosperous future for both sides.
And John Mearsheimer, I want to sort of ask you whether politicians, you think, play second fiddle to lobbyists.
There's no question that politicians play second fiddle to the lobby. All of those politicians who were going before the AIPAC conference and declaring their allegiance to Israel are doing that because they fear for their political life. There's no way that any politician in the United States Congress or in the White House or anybody who's serious in winning the presidency or winning a place on Capitol Hill could be honest about how he or she feels towards the special relationship between the United States and Israel. The political costs would just be too great. Actually, what we saw happen during the Biden visit is that Biden, in private, told Prime Minister Netanyahu that what Israel was doing was damaging American interests. And in fact, Biden went so far as to say that it was putting American soldiers at risk. We then found out that David Petraeus had pushed forward a briefing to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that said that Israeli intransigence was endangering American interests and, again, American lives. So when American leaders have an opportunity behind closed doors to speak their mind, they make it very clear that Israel is an albatross around our neck, which it clearly is. But of course, no politician can say that in public because he or she would have their career ended very quickly by the lobby. And everybody in Washington knows that. It's no great secret. It's just that most people are afraid to say it publicly.
Indeed, Joe Biden apparently said, what you are doing here undermines the security of our troops who are fighting in Iraq, Afghanistan and Pakistan, Ali Abu Nima. That's quite a condemnation, isn't it?
Yes, it's a serious condemnation, and I think what it shows is that the old talking points that have worked for years and years, and which we just heard from Meagan, are no longer working anymore. I think, as Secretary of State Clinton said, in the era of mass communications, it's no longer possible to hide the reality of apartheid, the reality of the suffering in Gaza, the fact that, you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu is in Washington talking about an economic miracle in the West Bank and how everyone is going to multiplexes, when everybody who has access to the internet or Al Jazeera knows that in the past 3 days, 4 Palestinian teenagers were shot dead by the Israeli army in the West Bank alone, that yesterday Gaza was bombed and apartment buildings were hit and 4 people were injured, that every night there are arrest raids in the West Bank and Palestinians being kidnapped by the occupation forces. It's no longer possible for the lobby to hide that, or for the Israel Project to bamboozle people with these happy talking points about a peace process and how Israel is making these great sacrifices for peace. And the other thing that's so, I think, worrying for Americans about the lobby, and you saw this last night if you watched the AIPAC conference, was the constant incitement for war with Iran. And this is an exact replay of what was happening at AIPAC conferences a decade ago, when you just replace Iran with Iraq, where we were told an Iraq armed with nuclear weapons would be a threat to the world, and, you know, we don't want to wait for proof in the form of mushroom clouds. The drumbeat for war with Iran that is coming out of the AIPAC convention is something that should absolutely alarm Americans. America is mired in wars already, and it doesn't need another war with Iran on behalf of Israel.
Meagan, Buren, is there a direct link between Iran and the peace process? Do you recognize that?
What I heard attending the AIPAC conference was distinctly different, and that was a real drumbeat pushing for peaceful options to deal with Iran today while there's still time. There's no question that people understand at this point that Iran is the largest state sponsor of terrorism worldwide, and that has a direct implication on the peace process.
Meagan,
when
does
Hezbollah
Israel
has
have
more
nuclear
arms
weapons?
today,
Hold
Can you
on,
tell us
Ali.
if Israel
Ali.
has nuclear weapons?
Ali, let Meagan finish her point, and I'll come to you.
Thank you.
Sure.
When Hezbollah is able to arm in such an extreme way, when Hamas on Israel's southern border is able to fire rockets, killing an innocent person just the other day while working in a farm field, Iran has a direct implication on what happens in terms of the peace process. And Americans understand that Iran and its links to terrorism and extremist ideology of a regime that isn't in the best interest of its own people. The issue is not against the Iranian people. The Iranian people are dying in the streets at the hands of their own regime. And it's not a regime that can be trusted with nuclear weapons, which is why I think it's so important to push for peaceful options today, real sanctions that can make a difference today.
Meagan, you've made that point. Ali?
Well, I'd just like to ask Meagan if Israel has nuclear weapons and whether she's concerned about that, because what's baffling to me is how, you know, all the people at AIPAC are saying we don't want to have a nuclear arms race in the region, and yet they don't seem to be concerned about Israel's massive nuclear arsenal, which is indeed a threat to the people of the region, and hundreds of millions of people in the region are terrified of Israel's nuclear weapons, and why why Meagan doesn't talk about that at all.
All right, Ali, we'll come back to that in a moment, and I'll put that to John as well. But having been around since the 60s, let's talk a little more about AIPAC. It is considered the most influential pro-Israel lobby in the US, with 100,000 members and attracting many senior political figures. The right-wing organization works to secure Israel and its relationship with the US. But it's no longer the only loud pro-Israeli voice in the States. J Street is a much younger lobby organisation created in 2008. It campaigns for a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine and supports the Obama administration. It believes in using diplomacy and talks to secure peace. J Street was one of the few Israeli lobby groups to criticise Israel's latest plans to build new settlements in occupied East Jerusalem. Also weighing in on the argument for the first time is the US military. Last week, in what was seen as a political statement, which is extremely rare and maybe unprecedented, General David Petraeus said the Israeli-Palestinian conflict foments anti-American sentiment due to a perception of US favoritism for Israel. Clearly, the tensions, the issues and so forth have an enormous effect. They set the strategic context within which we operate. When the AIPAC conference opened, a group of Jewish American activists gathered to protest about Israel and its settlement policies. Some also denounced American support for Israel.
Well, the people inside this conference need to understand that the large majority, 61% in a poll released this morning of the American people, think that these settlements should stop.
The U.S. should immediately stop funding all military activity in Israel. We fund a lot of arms. The IDF wouldn't have the strength that it does if it weren't for our money and our technology.
Hundreds, literally hundreds of congresspeople will come here and do their mandatory, I love Israel, I love Israel. Well, I think it's awful. I think it's bad for Israel. It's bad for the United States.
It's the damn arrogance. Really, honestly, that's the one that really makes an American's blood boil.
This ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, this grave injustice that has been done to them, has been going on for far too long, and I would just like to raise awareness about this and take responsibility as an American for what my country is doing.
Is this level of feeling ever reflected by the lobbyists, Meagan, Buren?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Is that feeling sort of that, in fact, you're past your sell-by date at the Israel project? You're not reflecting the true feelings of Israelis?
I think nothing could be further from the truth. The people that were at the AIPAC conference with me were strong supporters of America and strong supporters of Israel because they share the same values of freedom and democracy and hope for a better future for both sides. I think there's no question that we're hoping to work towards a two-state solution. And again, what seems to be forgotten in this conversation is that settlements have been frozen in the West Bank. Building has been frozen in the West Bank at the same time that checkpoints are coming down in the West Bank. And we're moving towards a better, more prosperous future in those areas for Palestinians.
I'll get Ali to answer that in a moment, but I want to get in here and talk to John about Iran, because that, to me, from AIPAC last night, seemed to be the elephant in the room. It came up almost as much as conversation about occupied lands and notional peace processes. Is Iran being used as a method to distract attention from the occupation?
No, I think they're two separate issues, and I think the Israelis and their hardline supporters in the United States have been deeply distressed over the past few weeks by the fact that so much attention has been focused on the settlements and on the colonization of the occupied territories. The Israelis want to do that with as little controversy as possible. What they really care about these days more than anything else is the Iranian threat. And it's quite clear that what Israel and its hardline supporters in the United States would like America to do is to bomb the nuclear sites in Iran and to make sure that Iran never acquires any kind of meaningful nuclear capability. If you look at the discourse in the United States on Iran, it's dominated by the lobby and by Israel itself. There's a constant drumbeat of efforts to get us to either threaten or to use military force against Iran. Of course, if you go to the Pentagon, especially if you talk to people in uniform, they will tell you almost to a person that it would be crazy for the United States to start another war in the Arab and Islamic world. We're already up to our eyeballs in alligators in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Why in God's name would we want another war in Iran? But this, of course, is exactly what the Israelis and their supporters at AIPAC want.
Is John right, Ali?
I think he's absolutely right, and I think you know what's so out of tune with Meagan's talking points and with Netanyahu's speech last night is that Israel wants the United States in a civilizational war with people in the Arab world and Islam, because that's really the only game for Israel to survive as a U.S. ally, to convince us that, you know, it's a war of the West against the barbarians and Israel is our best ally. But I think what Americans want to move towards, and the whole world wants to move towards, is some sort of dialogue, some sort of accommodation, an end to war, hopefully. But Israel really thrives on confrontation. It survived as a U.S. ally in the 1960s and 70s by being a so-called asset in the Cold War, or at least marketing itself as one. And now it markets itself as an asset in the so-called war on terror. And what's so remarkable is so much of the pro-Israel rhetoric in this country depends on demonizing and denigrating Muslims and Arabs. And that's really the only sort of argument you can make, because the sort of argument Meagan is making, that Israel really wants peace and loves peace and is working towards a two-state solution, is patent nonsense when you look at what's happening on the ground. I mean, nobody, as I'd agree with Benjamin Netanyahu, nobody can deny the Jewish history in Jerusalem. But what Israel is doing is actually working to deny and erase Palestinian presence and history in Jerusalem with
Ali,
the demolitions in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan.
Yeah, let's go straight to Meagan. Meagan?
I think that what we heard was American officials over and over again, saying that the interest is the same in making sure that Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons. This isn't a threat to Israel. It's not just a threat to Israel. It's a threat to the entire world. And more specifically, it's a threat to other peace-loving people in the Middle East region. For years, there has been a strong nuclear nonproliferation regime. But what we see today is the beginnings of a nuclear arms race.
Has Israel
Egypt,
signed it?
Saudi Arabia, Kuwait.
Has
all
Israel
of these
signed the
now
NPT,
are
Meagan?
saying,
It hasn't.
all of these countries are now saying that they, thank you, all of these countries are saying now that they need to acquire nuclear power because just like Israel, other countries in the region are threatened by a nuclear Iran. It's why the time to act is now in peaceful actions to prevent Iran from gaining.
Very briefly, John, I want to know why the Arab world seems to be losing the PR battle. Just about everybody is on the side of the Palestinians outside of Israel. The Quartet, for example, a global lobby, but they seem to be losing. Why is that?
Well, the fact is that the Palestinians are beginning to win the global battle for public opinion. There has been a huge shift in time, over time, in our discourse about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As Ali was saying before, it used to be the case that the lobby here in the United States could dominate the discourse. With the internet, that's no longer the case. And if you listen to the speeches, especially Alan Dershowitz's speech at the AIPAC conference on Sunday, you see very clearly that Israel's hardline supporters are very worried about the fact that the discourse is shifting against them. And I would argue that with the passage of time, as it becomes more and more apparent to more and more Americans that we have a special relationship with an apartheid state, more and more Americans are going to want to change that relationship. It goes against core American values.
Meagan, the lobby system is basically dishonest. Whoever holds the purse strings, whoever contributes the most, decides the policy. Is that the right way to go forward?
I disagree that that's the case. I don't think that this is an issue that's based on money. I think it's an issue that's based on values. And I'm not the person to ask. The person to ask is Secretary of State Clinton. The person to ask is Senators Schumer that spoke last night. And I think if you speak with them and you speak with the other American officials that attended AIPAC, they'll tell you time and time again that this is a personal issue to them because they believe in Israel as a strong strategic interest of the United States. And that's why their support lies with Israel and working towards a two-state solution.
We'll leave it there. In Washington, D.C., Meagan Buren, Director of Research and Training at the Israel Project. Thank you very much. In Chicago, John Mearsheimer, Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Thank you very much. And in South Bend, Indiana, Ali Abunimah, co-founder of the website electronicintifada.net. Thank you very much indeed to all of you. Thank you as well for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Stephen Cole. Goodbye for now.